at 4 o'clock, so I just want to go ahead and get started. I'm Liz Perry from Crow Canyon, to everyone who is watching us today. And hopefully, if you're in a warm or smoky climate, you can come indoors and spend at least the next hour or so with us instead. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and move into our usual introduction for our Thursday webinars with our land acknowledgement. Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Ute, Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. Our mission-related work is not possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future, and we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. We are grateful to all Indigenous people, and we support the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Thank you to all of our partners in our mission at Crow Canyon. Just a quick Zoom reminder to put your questions at any time during the presentation into the Q&A. People actually do chat in the chat, so we don't want to miss your question if it goes in there instead of in the Q&A. And if Zoom is giving you headaches, just hop on over to our live stream on Facebook, or you can watch us after the fact on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe. There are lots and lots of amazing past webinars on there right now. We have some wonderful talks coming up the next 2 weeks. Really excited about next week with our good friend and former schoolmate, professor at Colorado Boulder and former Crow Canyon researcher, what all of us can learn from the old ones. This is part of our 40th anniversary series. 2023 is our 40th anniversary year, and Scott's presentation is actually derived from our forthcoming volume for our 40th anniversary. So please tune in. It's a really, really wonderful presentation. And after that, we have Bedrock Groundstone Features, Landscape, Social Identity, and Ritual Space on the High Plains with Dr. Elizabeth Lynch. Very much looking forward to talking about a little bit of a different landscape next week, as we are today. Without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for our talk today and thank them very much for joining us to share their recent research. Miles Miller has been researching the indigenous cultures of southern New Mexico in Trans-Pecos, Texas for 40 years. He's a principal investigator with Verser, formerly Geomarine, for those of you who have worked in the CRM industry, and co-editor of the brand new volume, Earth, Ovens, and Desert Lifeways, 10,000 Years of Indigenous Cooking in the Arid Landscapes of North America. He has been awarded the 2018 Award of Excellence in Cultural Resource Management by the Society for American Archaeology for his work. Dr. John Speth is the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor Emeritus of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Michigan, which explains his current location today, where he continues to publish and give public talks on his research. He's published or co-authored 10 books and monographs, many articles on his fieldwork, the latest one co-authored with Jamie Clark entitled Living and Dying on the Periphery. The archaeology and human remains from two 13th to 15th century villages in southeastern New Mexico, zoo archaeology and modern human origins, human hunting behavior during the later Pleistocene, also co-edited with Jamie Clark, and the paleoanthropology and archaeology of big game hunting, protein, fat, or politics, human paleoecology in the Levantine corridor, bison kills and bone counts, decision-making by ancient hunters. So I think you're probably trying to get the picture of his research over a long and prestigious career. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers with gratitude for joining us today. Thank you so much. And much gratitude to everyone watching who supports us. We had lots of wonderful donations coming in from folks who registered for this webinar. So thank you so much, everyone, and to our speakers.
Okay. Okay, is the screen up?
Your
Looks
comments are
good.
clear.
All right. Well, I'd really like to thank Crow Canyon for inviting John and I to talk about really fascinating group of sites way out on southeast New Mexico on the Southern Plains. It's kind of outside and beyond the boundaries of the usual southwestern focus of Crow Canyon webinars. But as we'll see, there are some real interesting Southwest connections in what we're going to talk about. And there's a lot of information. I'm only going to be able to hit a few high points, and you're welcome to contact us for volumes and reports and so forth. But as we go, you'll see some of the major points on architecture and the faunal remains and other things as we go through this. I have to give a shout out to the Bureau of Land Management, the Carlsbad Field Office, and the Permian Basin Programmatic Agreement. This is a really visionary programmatic agreement document on how we do cultural resource management in Section 106 out in the West. I can't go into it too much, but there are two excellent articles on it in Advances in Archaeological Practice. I recommend you look at those if you want to know about the history and application of this CRM program. So we are out here on the Southern Plains, Merchant Site, way in the very southeast corner in Lee County of New Mexico. Salt Cedar Site is a similar site in Texas. It is the subject of Mike Collins' 1968 MA thesis and offers some corroborative data. The Roswell oasis that John will be speaking of. And we are at pretty much the very southern extent of the Southern Plains. We have the Rio Grande Pueblos, Salinas or Chupadero Pueblos, and the Jornada Mogollon region, which are pretty much the eastern boundary, or the conventional idea of what is the eastern boundary of the Southwest out here. Now we have to understand that the Merchant Site was excavated, or mostly excavated, by an avocational society, the Lee County Archaeological Society, from 1959 to 1963, over 60 years ago, way out in southeastern New Mexico. This really dedicated group of avocationals tried to do some work and actually document the site and recover information, while unfortunately it was also being heavily looted. They would go away for a weekend, and these looters would come in and dig into the walls of the Kiva and undermine things and virtually strip mine across the middens and dig into rooms. So there was a lot of damage. We lost all the artifacts, unfortunately, from the Lee County work. And then there was some confusion too, because things did not get fully published. There's a 1965 site map and brief article by Robert Buss Leslie, who's kind of the lead of the society, and a later map from an unpublished manuscript. And you can see some of the discrepancies. Here is a kind of scattering of rooms, and here is a nice L-shaped block of contiguous rooms. Here is a round pit structure, or what we now know is a kiva, and here's a square kiva. Here is the Grama Ridge Escarpment. It's located on top of an escarpment. So there was a lot of discrepancies, and all we had were these really tantalizing ideas of way out where things should not be. Contiguous room Pueblo, a southwestern indigenous corrugated ceramic type, and baby kivas. And that's all we knew for many, many years. John Speth did a visit there in 1984 and did a little bit of excavation and mapping, but we really didn't know. And due to the extensive damage to the site, we did not know was there. So the BLM contracted us to do remedial work and try to figure out. And here is the map based on 2 seasons of field work, which we now see there are 50 to 60 contiguous rooms of Hakal architecture. It truly is a L-shaped Pueblo. Here is the terrace edge of that escarpment, and with additional rooms going south along the escarpment. There could be additional rooms down here that we did not get to explore. This area of little brown accentuated rooms, this is what we excavated in 2019, showing there are intact rooms all over this eastern room block. The LCAS excavated a couple rooms over here, huge midden areas. This is where they threw lots of the bone that came out of the fill deposits of this kiva. So 50 to 60 room kiva with a plaza, 1 to 2 kivas, dense midden deposits, a true Pueblo-like settlement. So look at the domestic architecture. It's not very formal. These are shallow Hakal rooms. One thing that's important is the whole site was very shallow. Here's a test unit. Right under here is a layer of indurated cemented caliche carbonate that is rock hard. The whole site's only 20, 30 centimeters deep, so everything was shallow, which caused problems for preservation when they looted through it and cattle trampling it and so forth. But we were able to recover some of these rooms. They are Hakal structures. Wattle and daub are mud and stick. You can see the outline of the melted clay used in the walls, along with the cimiento, or the stone foundation walls that supported the bases of those Hakal rooms. These are the southern rooms. Here are some examples from the LCAS work in the early 60s. Again, stone foundations. This is room 5. Here's what we identified room 5 in 2015. We think this rock is probably the same rock here after all those years, but everything has been kicked around by cattle and looters and backfilled. Another room, room 9, there's the nice foundation walls that supported the Hakal sticks, and collared floor hearths, which collared floor hearths are a distinctive trait in some southwestern pueblos. Here is the room block we excavated in 2019. This is mostly due to the masterful excavation work of Tim Graves. Again, these rooms were strip looted. They had holes in them, which conveniently, after they dug a looter pit inside the room, they left a tin can to let us know that's where they looted. But it removed segments of walls. The walls were kicked around by cattle. It's a miracle that we were able to identify anything at all, but sure enough, there are room walls, cimiento, and there's a room here. You can see even remnants of room walls extending out to the side. And from Tim's map here, there are additional rooms. There's 3 tiers of rooms. It's a pretty substantial size settlement, although again, these are informal Hakal structures. They had central floor hearths. Very seldom did they have roof supports, because the roofs were probably pretty insubstantial collections of mud and sticks, because this is probably the construction method. Wall and daub, mud and stick, are what we call Hakal in the Southwest, with insubstantial roofs. There's not a lot of wood out there to use for nice roof beams and supports. It's mostly all mesquite. So these are small mesquite branches chinked together with mud. Here is a reconstruction by Mark Willis of probably what the Pueblo might have looked like. So we have a contiguous room Pueblo. Next is, what about Kivas? Well, I start this with Watson Smith's quote: "There are many pitfalls for the unwary Southwesternist, but perhaps the easiest to fall into and most difficult to climb out of is that of the Kiva." Now, if this applied to Southwestern Kivas, it applies even more so to somebody trying to drag the concept of Kiva way out into the Southwestern plain or Southeastern plains. There's not supposed to be any. But during the excavations and during the looting, the LCAS and Bus Leslie noted that most of the rooms they dug were real shallow, and they encountered that rock-hard caliche carbonate. But in one area, the looters were digging these deep pits that were artifact-rich deposits going down 1 meter or so. So they started excavating in those, and they expanded it out, and these were deep pit structures. And one of the signature achievements of Bus Leslie, this avocational, is back in 1961 or 2, he fully documented the stratigraphy in this Kiva. And that's critical. There were 2 floors, and one of the most signature aspects was there was a 12-inch layer of large mammal bone. This wasn't a midden with some bones tossed in. This was a solid, contiguous layer of thousands of large mammal bison, antelope, deer bone in one deposit. It's what we now know was a closure deposit in this Kiva. We know of southwestern Kiva closure deposits throughout the Southwest. This was a plains variation of closing this Kiva. It's really fascinating. And we have some photographs that Bus Leslie took, usually of family members, that give us some important clues. Here's a map he made. It shows it somewhat square or rectangular, although he comments that the walls are really dug into. And here is when they first started exploring one of the pits dug by the looters. There's one of the really nice prepared floors down there. And his son, Bus Leslie's son, is digging into that deposit of bone, and there's some bone down to the side. It's not a very controlled excavation, but it's better than what the looters did. So BLM contracted us to stabilize this. These excavations stayed open for almost 60 years to the elements. And if you look, here is Midden B with all the churned up looter deposits, and off in the background, you can see the size of the back dirt pile that came out of that Kiva. It's over, from here to here, it's over 20 meters in diameter. of back dirt. And then for 60 years, it also backwashed back into the Kiva. And so we were contracted to stabilize, see if there was any information left. There's our first exploratory trench to look at the stratigraphy to guide our work. Here we're excavating this quadrant of the back dirt pile. We actually had to stop here because we were recovering so much bone and material culture. It was massively going to overload the curation capacities of the institution we were going to, of Museum of New Mexico. So this was massive deposit here, just astronomical. It looks kind of square, but it was really beat up. You can see how this part is more circular. We really can't tell square circular. But we found a third floor. Here's all the backwash stratified deposits. One more floor with floor features, a mono, and some caliche plastered. So there were actually 3 floors in this Kiva. So I keep saying Kiva. Are we going to buy into this concept of Kiva way out on the southeastern plains? Well, they cut through 60 centimeters of this indurated caliche carbonate that's hard to break through with stone tools. And here's one of the mauls that LCAS found that they probably used to beat through that. And they did that to create a structure the size and depth of southwestern Kivas. There were multiple floors and remodeling events. They did find a few unusual artifacts, bone rasps, carved pendant inside the fill. From the floor features, there was charged maize, and we found maize pollen and cattail pollen in the subfloor features. And we all know the importance of maize and cattail pollen in southwestern ritual use. And of course, that closure deposit. Now we, based on the numbers, let's look at that closure deposit. Based on the numbers of what we recovered from the backwash fill and the sample of back dirt, the volumetrics we used to estimate 67,000 bison and large mammal bones, and 22,000 artifacts were present in the fill and closure deposits of that Kiva. And you have to keep in mind, these deposits were biased by the LCAS and the looters, taking over 1,000 projectile points. That's a lot of projectile points. All the finished tools, the nice ceramics and other artifacts with them, leaving only the debitage and the bones. So the artifact counts were even higher. And over 46%, nearly half of the projectile points from the site, they had 4,000 points. That is a lot for a southwestern site. And most of the Ochoa-ware sherds, decorated ceramics, other things were from these closure deposits inside the Kiva, 2 different layers, and including that solid bone layer. Now, when we look at the closure deposits and the other midden and refuse deposits all together that we excavated, we estimate over 100,000 to 150,000 bones, 80% of which are large and very large mammal, are present at the merchant site. That is an astronomical amount of faunal material. We have a database of 80 middens in the nearby Jornada region. None of them come with the order of magnitude of this amount of material. It is a massive amount of hunting out on the southern plains and bringing that material back to this settlement. Now, it wasn't just bison, it was a dual economy. There was also maize. We had maize pollen, maize macrobot, and there were maize phytoliths and residues in some of the ceramics we looked at. And north of the site were all these areas of caliche that had these kind of gridded appearance, these rectangular appearance. A previous seismic survey identified this as maybe another pueblo, although that's really reasonable because of these horizontal or linear patterns. But there were very few artifacts out there. Several of the crew had worked in northern New Mexico on gridded fields or chin fields in Arizona, and there was a consensus that these had some similarities to those. So again, if dragging kivas out in southeast New Mexico is somewhat controversial, dragging gridded fields out there is even more so. So some of these areas, they had these L-shaped or 90-degree angles that don't occur in nature. This little spot here in this particular area is important because Susan Smith, our palynologist, sampled it. There were also check dams down the drainage. Here is the village or the Pueblo area along the escarpment. 160 meters to the north are where these features are. There's several of them along this drainage. Mark Willis, with his aerial drone mapping, did a 5 centimeter topo map of the area. It's sensitive enough, you may not be able to see it, but right where my arrow is pointing, you can see the hole from that unbackfilled Kiva sitting there that his topographic map and aerial drone picked up. The highest point in the area is right here, and this drainage leading from it is where all these suspected fields are in this hydrologically favorable setting where water would drain and collect in these fields. Our collections are grids of caliche cobbles. So BLM funded some of the work to clear and excavate them. We cleared the vegetation. Now these have been stomped by cattle since 1880. A lot of things were displaced, but still there's some hint of these squared patterns where caliche was removed to the sides to retain water and probably maize planted in the inside. And from the plan map, here is that spot I showed just a second ago. And that is where Susan Smith's sample found maize pollen. So we have maize pollen from these fields, and also the diatoms. Diatoms are a sign of moist or wet environments. The diatom samples from these fields and from the check dams are order of magnitude higher in count than the samples, the control samples off the area and from the rooms and the kivas, showing these places retain water. So we probably had southwestern like gridded fields are out there on the merchant site. Now the material culture, the signature ceramic is Ochoa ware. Ochoa obliterated, indented, corrugated, a very distinctive ceramic with, it looks kind of southwestern because southwestern ceramics are corrugated wares. Our corrugated wares are a southwestern tradition, and there are several other indented corrugated, although the signature part of Ochoa is it's kind of obliterated. Now, we aren't saying this derives from any specific one. Genevieve Woodhead looked closely at the manufacturing and the practices in making Ochoa and could not link the techniques and the spacing and method of coiling specifically to another southwestern tradition, but it probably has some or inspiration or derivation from something in the Southwest. So we did neutron activation analysis, found 3 major groups, merchant group and 2 groups in Texas. Now it's distinctive, very chemically distinctive. This is the 2,151 samples in the Southeast Southwest NAE database that Jeff Ferguson and I have been working with for about 15 years. This is dozens of types, hundreds of sites, and you look at that group and look how distinctive merchant is in geochemical hyperspace. It's extremely distinctive. You can't mistake it for anything else, but it's also very homogeneous. There's very little variation because it's only being produced within specific villages. What is really interesting is this merchant main group is all merchant sherds. We did not find it anywhere outside merchant. It's not showed up anywhere in John's sites in the Roswell oasis, nowhere in other Ochoa phase sites. And of all the merchant sherds, only one was one of these other Texas groups. This is a really circumscribed ceramic distribution. And again, looking at that Southeast database, there are hundreds of sites that have samples of 10 to 20. And with only one other case, there is always 2, 3, 4 compositional groups are different production areas represented in a southwestern site. Sherds going out, sherds coming in from different groups. That is not happening here. And that's a real interesting point for looking at social interaction, identity, and so forth in these new sites on the plains. And you can kind of quick comparison, Chupadero black and white, another really well-known southwestern type that's distributed all over southern New Mexico, West Texas, Chihuahua, and Texas, compared to Ochoa, which is only found at these villages, even though these 2 types are contemporaneous. It's a really circumscribed ceramic made by specific communities of practice only at merchant and these other sites. And quickly, the other main material culture, the lithic raw materials, we're going to compare the Ochoa to these. We did sourcing using ultraviolet fluorescent light response because lithic types, lithic materials, Georgetown chert in Central Texas, and alabates, tecovas, and opalite sources in the Texas Panhandle all react to exposure to ultraviolet light. So we did all of the lithics under light conditions. This is opalite, showing how it makes that nice bright green ultraviolet reaction. Our results were that something over 40% of all the chipstone, that includes the debitage, the flakes, cores, points, tools, reacted, showing 40% of the chipstone materials came from sources 200 to 300 or more kilometers away from the merchant site. And even the projectile points, the orange, which is coded orange here, orange-yellow reactions are Edwards Plateau from Central Texas. Green and white-gray reactions are from the Texas Panhandle. And over 75% of the projectile points had those reactions, showing they were made from cherts obtained on these long-distance hunting forays. And it applies to the completeness categories. We looked at complete basal fragments that would have come in with the halves, and tips maybe broken in manufacture are in the meat that came back, and all those different fragments are part of what was taken back to the site. So here we have this circumscribed distribution of Ochoa ceramics only within the merchant site, and chipstone materials used for their tools coming from Central Texas and in the Panhandle, and there were higher quantities that came from Edwards Plateau as opposed to the Panhandle. That is a little bit different from what John has found at Roswell, and he will talk about that. So it sets up a real interesting case on a residential site with agriculture, this local circumscribed ceramics, where the identity and whatever is being signified by ceramics is more internal rather than external, symbol in stylistic expression. And then these long distance hunting forays for, here's the scale, you're looking at 200, at least 200, 150 kilometers, bringing back these materials. And to summarize all that quickly, leading into John's study, these foundational events leading to the settling of the merchant site in the early to mid 1300s involved the complex interplay of purposive social actions and economic decisions. And we talk about migration. There probably was some form of migration, but the more interesting aspects are not just the migration itself, but this interplay of these new actions, these new subsistence, political and ritual economies that required new forms of social and political arrangements, intermarriage, perhaps even fluid expressions of ethnicities. And so these cooperative and competitive aspects of long-range hunting expeditions combined with sedentary settlement at merchant present a fascinating case of hybridity, heterogeneity, merging Southwestern and Plains material culture, ceramics, subsistence economies, and architecture into something new and unprecedented on the Southern Plains. And these developments profoundly altered the historical trajectory of settlement adaptation social arrangements in a lot of adjacent regions in southeastern New Mexico, west central Texas, and all these adjacent regions during the 14th century and probably beyond. And so that leads into what John will be talking about.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you.
Okay, well, we'll go for it here. My thanks also to Crow Canyon for the invitation to join this webinar, and to everybody who is tuned in. It's really marvelous to get a chance to talk to you all and talk about an area that both Miles and I dearly love. What I'm going to talk about in some ways is remarkably similar to merchant, and in some ways remarkably different. And I'll try to bring both aspects out as we go along. I'm trying to advance it. We have set this up so that actually Miles will be, we weren't sure. I'm out in the boonies in Michigan right now, and we weren't sure if the Wi-Fi was going to work well. So Miles, if you can go ahead and advance it, great. I just throw this in. The map will show you we're still in southeastern New Mexico. a little bit north and west of Merchant, just about 11 miles outside of a town you all know and love, even if you haven't been there, and that's Roswell, alien capital of the universe. And the picture on the left I threw in simply so you can see some of my favorite scenery. I love mountains, but preferably on the horizon. I like it hot. This is an old military road, actually, that ran before Roswell was built. Already it ran from the Pecos Valley out to the west to Fort Stanton. And one of the sites I'll be talking, actually both Henderson and Bloom Mound, two of the sites I'll be talking about are within just a few hundred meters of this, where I was standing taking the photograph. The mountain you see in the distance is called the Capitans. It's sort of a funny little eastern extension of the Sacramento Mountains in southeastern New Mexico. And it marks kind of the traditional boundary of the Southwest. Miles, the next one. What I'm going to talk about initially and to a large extent is the origins of Plains-Pueblo interaction. And the traditional view, first of all, it's based largely on observations made by the early Spanish entradas, Coronado and Oñate and others, who observed groups of what they called dog nomads. They had literally dog trains loaded with packs and sometimes pulling travois that would travel to the pueblos and loaded with products of the bison hunt. And the Spaniards described them as, some of them at least, overwintering at the pueblos. And archaeology has tended to support that. And it's led to I won't say a universal view, but perhaps the dominant view now, that this kind of interaction emerged probably around AD 1450. And it was coincident in time with the entry of the Athabascans, the ancestral Navajo and Apache, and other Athabascan speaking groups who came in from the north, ultimately from the boreal forest areas in northern Canada and Alaska. That's the conventional view, and they view it as a form of relationship, sometimes called mutualism, between sedentary village farmers and full-time bison hunting specialists. So that's now the kind of the conventional model, and it's based very heavily on what these few early Spanish expeditions saw and observed. And unfortunately, they're wonderful descriptions, but all way too brief. And so there's not much detail. And so you can kind of make up a lot of stories, but this is the one that has, I think, stuck. Specialists in bison interacting with specialists in farming. What I want to try to show you today is the Roswell data suggests that this kind of interaction began quite a bit earlier, probably in the latter part of the 1200s and 1300s, and that instead of involving bison hunting specialists and sedentary village farmers, it actually involved dual economies, very much like merchant. That is, people who were doing a lot of farming, but who were also heavily into bison hunting. In other words, they were doing both. And they served in many ways as middlemen in exchanges between Plains and the sort of classic or heartland of the Southwest. So it's a somewhat different view. It moves it earlier. And instead of being specialists on both sides, it's actually suggesting that you have economies that were mixed economies of both farming and hunting. Next one, Miles. I'm going to talk mostly about the Henderson site. It's about 11 miles southwest of downtown Roswell. It's on a major tributary of the Pecos, the Hondo River. It's not much to look at on the surface, but excavation and mapping and so forth suggests that it had at least 75 rooms. It could have had as many as 100. It was badly pot hunted. But there's still a huge amount of information that both that I was able to get out of it with fairly limited excavation. I think I only excavated about 11% of the site. There's a lot more of it left. But to describe it, it's a capital E with three shorter arms pointing roughly towards the south, and then what I call the main bar. And between these shorter arms of the E are two plazas, an East Plaza and a West Plaza. This site had no kivas that we could find, but it had two gigantic earth ovens filled with fire-cracked rock and buffalo bones, plus other things, and we'll talk about that a bit. And those are marked with the stars on this slide. They were, I mean, literally, we're talking about thousands of buffalo bones. So summarizing some of the Pueblo-like aspects of the site, it's adjoining rooms, 75, perhaps as many as 100, with plazas. The ceramics are very typical Southwestern ceramics. We had no demonstrable Plains ceramic types, and we had very few Plains artifacts. The classic things like tibia, bison tibia digging sticks and scapula hose, or various types of knives and so forth that are really characteristic of this time period in the Plains. The dating, I should say, is based largely on the material we found. We did run a bunch of radiocarbon dates. They didn't tell us much that we didn't already know from the material we picked on the off the surface. And I've indicated the dates, roughly late 1200s through the better part of the 1300s. It had no kivas, but it had these giant roasting features, chock full of bison bones, and a very sort of un-Pueblo-like feature of eating dogs in very public and probably ceremonial contexts. Next slide. We were able to roughly date the construction of the site and break it into two phases. These are arbitrary, they're not absolute dates, but we based it on the thickness and curvature of the rims of one ceramic type called El Paso polychrome. And there are a few sherds of it shown down at the bottom. It's a ceramic type. It was the dominant one at the Henderson site, and it was also referred to as the tin can of Casas Grandes. So you can get an idea. It has a whopping distribution from southeastern New Mexico all the way across into Chihuahua. And by using that, we were able to break the occupation into two phases. In early, we called them simply the early phase and late phase. If I were to guess at the dates, the early phase would be late 1200s to early 1300s, and the late phase would be mostly the 1300s. The next slide. Now, we explored a number of issues that were quite interesting, and one of them has to do with the grinding surface area of the monos. And Bob Hard and colleagues used that, the grinding surface area, as a way of estimating the importance of agriculture. The way he went about it basically was to take ethnographic cases where the dependence on agriculture had been ranked in the so-called ethnographic atlas by George Peter Murdoch, and it was broken down into 8 categories that basically went from no dependence to very high dependence. And he looked at groups where he could get data on mono area and the grinding area, and found that they were fairly closely correlated. Jenny Adams has come up with a lot of complications in this, and we don't have time to talk about those. But let's say, as a crude indicator, its larger grinding surface area does point perhaps to a greater dependence on agriculture. The other attribute shown in this graph is maize ubiquity. And what that is simply, we did a lot of flotation, and every sample we took had at least one fragment, usually burned cupule from corn. So they're very high ubiquity. This doesn't talk about how much corn, but simply that every sample we looked at, regardless, room fill, features, hearths, didn't matter. We always found at least one cupule of corn. It was everywhere. And there are several sites we're going to talk about briefly: Fox Place, Bloom Mound, and Henderson. You'll see that all three of these fall up at this area that's on the border between moderate and high dependence on agriculture. Now, I'm going to very shortly talk about a pit house to Pueblo transition in Roswell. And I don't think it's driven by intensifying agriculture. And this is one of the lines of evidence. All the sites, the early pit house, so-called earlier pit house sites, and the later, they're all late prehistoric. The later Pueblo-like villages all seem to have a fairly high dependence on maize or on agriculture. Next slide. They were doing a lot of bison hunting, and some very interesting things happen. Plotted on the left is the percentage of, if you have a certain number of animals killed, and you can base it on whatever is the most common bone. Let's say if there were 100 skulls, you know that at least 100 animals had to have been killed. And then you look at how many of the other bones you have, and you know how many you should have if you had 100 animals killed, but you usually don't find that many. And so that becomes the percentage of expected. And the lower axis, the horizontal axis, is a measure of the food value of each body part of the bison. And what you can see here is the highest food value parts are the most common at Henderson, and the least common are the low food value parts. It's not unexpected. What they were doing was bringing in large quantities of the most valuable parts. And you can come up with, they're being selective. I mean, without a pickup truck, a bison is very big to bring back. And so they're choosing body parts. And what we're finding is that the more animals you take in a single kill, the more selective you have to be. And the farther away you go, the more selective you'll have to be. It's going to be difficult to sort those two out, but I'll show you that over time at Henderson, they became more and more selective of high utility parts, suggesting that either they were traveling farther or they were killing more bison. On the right, I sexed a lot of the bison bones. And I used as a control the sexed specimens in the Smithsonian in Washington, and then plotted the Henderson sex ratios. And what's interesting about that is, first, it's predominantly bulls. It's about 70%, 67% bulls. They're targeting, they are taking cows, but they're targeting bulls. And the red points on there, if you can see them, are immature. These are bones that aren't completely fused yet. And even those are bigger than the females. So that means that not only are they taking mostly bull adults or adult bulls, they're taking juvenile bulls in preference to juvenile females. And presumably they simply weren't bringing a lot of the female parts back. That is a classic signature of spring kills. The cows are in worse shape because they're either pregnant or nursing, and the forage doesn't green up until the summer rains come. So they're feeding their fetus or their nursing calf from their body fat reserves, and the hunters knew that damned well, and so they're targeting bulls, and it mattered even with the juveniles. So it's a classic spring signature. And so I think that's when much of the bison hunting is being done. Next slide. They're also trading, and this sort of blew us away. There are a lot of non-local sherds, and by non-local, we're talking about sherds from Chihuahua, from Casas Grandes, from southern Arizona, from the Zuni area. And we calculated out of the total ceramic assemblage the percentages by phase. Now, bear in mind, these phases, including bloom, are ranked on the basis of that seriation of the rims. And you'll see that in early phase Henderson, they're only about 2% of the sherds are non-local. And by non-local, I'm talking about ceramics that are coming easily from more than 100 miles away. By late phase, it's 7%, and by bloom, it's 9%. Now, that may not sound like much until you look at Casas Grandes. Everybody assumes that's one of the most broadly connected sites in the Southwest, and they defined non-local as more than 90 miles away. And they're still only at 2.6% of the assemblage. Now, it's a much, much bigger site, but in some ways, it's more isolated in terms, at least of the classic Southwestern ceramics, than Roswell was. And this is speculation, but the El Paso polychrome, which is the dominant ceramic at Henderson, somebody needs to test this, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was being made in the Tularosa Basin, which would probably be about 150 miles away. So that I could say that even the so-called local stuff, or the dominant ceramics in the site, are probably also non-local in the sense that they're coming easily from more than 100 miles away. The Chupadero looks like it's being made in the Salinas area, and that's more than 100 miles away. These folks are traveling a lot. Next slide. Now, one of the really interesting things was, if you plot the fauna, the percentage that is in domestic trash as opposed to in these public earth oven complexes. In a sense, I think those earth oven complexes are kind of like Kivas. They're public and they're probably ceremonial, and they have closure offerings in them. We have buried turkey skeletons in them that aren't burned. And I think what they did is when they were finished with it, they emptied it out, placed these turkeys in the bottom of these features, and then filled them back in. And what you can see is that the small, first of all, it's a logarithmic plot, so it makes things look closer together than they really are. But you have all the small fauna, and there's not much difference between room and plaza roasting feature samples. But when you get to dogs in the late phase, all of a sudden, most of the dogs are out in these public earth ovens. And I think they are serving as a ceremonial food or public food, which is a very Plains-like feature. And you can see the bison jumps from 50% in the early phase in domestic context to over 80% in the late phase context. It's becoming a very public resource. In addition, I mentioned this briefly, in the late phase, the utility goes way up, which either means they're hunting a lot more bison or they're traveling a lot farther to do it and having to be far more selective in what they bring back. In addition, there are a lot fewer bison ribs in the late phase than in the early phase. And bison ribs are first of all, they're one of the fattest muscle units. That's why everybody likes barbecued ribs. And they are the easiest to dry and transport. And they drop out of the assemblage. They decline in the late phase. Now, you could immediately say, well, dogs were hungrier, and so they were eating a lot of the ribs up. But you look at the delicate antelope ribs, and there's no change in their frequency. So it's not because dogs were chewing them up. If dogs were chewing them up, they would have destroyed the antelope ribs first, and they didn't. So, and if you look at the faunal assemblages like Kate Spielman's work in the Salinas area, what they found there in the way of bison was mostly ribs. Now, it doesn't mean they came from Henderson, but I think it's part of that same system. They were trading, as at least this is one that leaves an archaeological signature. Dried bison ribs, I think, were a major part of the exchange. And then, of course, as I already mentioned, tremendous quantity of non-local ceramics. Next slide. I mentioned this Pittas to Pueblo transition. We have data on 4 sites. And on the bottom right of the slide, you can see they're arranged based on that El Paso polychrome rim seriation. They go from Fox Place At the beginning, the earliest part of the sequence, which I think would date roughly around 1250, to Bloom Mound, which I think is late 1300s, early 1400s. And it goes from scattered round pit houses to square pit houses to Pueblo-like room blocks at both Henderson and Bloom. Next slide. And this shows it. Fox Place on the left, very few trade ceramics, almost no bison. And bear in mind, Fox still had, based on mono grinding area, suggested a high dependence on agriculture, or moderate to high. Then you get to Rocky Arroyo, you have rectangular pit rooms and possibly organized around a plaza, tons of bison, but very few trade goods, very few trade ceramics. You get to Henderson in 2 phases, and you get tons of bison and a sharp increase in these long distance trade goods. And then Bloom Mound, which is only about a little less than a mile from Henderson, even more trade goods, almost no bison, and a lot of evidence of warfare. A lot of mutilated bodies, burned, unburied, lying on room floors, in room fill and so forth, and Toya points, which are not a local style. These are found more typically in Central Texas. Next slide. We looked at the, like Miles did, we looked at the fluorescence of the projectile points, and we have both alabates, which is the green, and that's up in the Texas Panhandle north of Amarillo. And we have the orange, which is from the Edwards Plateau. And what you see is Merchant was getting mostly Central Texas, the Edwards material. We have much more alabates, and we're a lot closer to alabates. Well, maybe somewhat closer, at least. But what's interesting is both fall off by Bloom Mound. And as you can see, the Edwards starts to fall off faster. And in Bloom, you have no more bison and lots of warfare, although a lot of trade. And if you want a hypothesis that fits with a lot of the early Spanish chronicles for the Edwards Plateau area, a lot of warfare, competition over access to the bison herds, and possibly competition over access to trading partners, some of whom were in the Pueblo area. Next slide. I'm going to pull together very briefly here what we've found. What happens in Roswell seems to be that bison hunting starts first. You have dual economies emerging that are, and we don't know much about the pre 1200s, and I would love to see more research out there to see what's going on in the 1000s, 1100s, and so forth. But bison hunting takes off in the 1200s, but there's almost no evidence of trade. In other words, they're hunting and they're also corn farming, or they're farming, and a lot of it's maize. So I think they're doing fairly intensive farming, but they're still living in pit houses and small, round, scattered pit houses. Then by early phase Henderson, the amount of bison goes up. The amount of trading begins to increase, and we're talking about in the late 12 to early 1300s. And by late phase Henderson, a huge amount of trade and a lot of bison hunting. That's when I think the real Plains-Pueblo interaction begins. So it'd be in the 1300s, at least a century earlier than the conventional model, and probably, although this is something that remains hypothetical, I'm not sure that Athabascans are involved in this yet, although I don't know that. And then these dual economies get, I think, involved in intensive warfare. The area is abandoned sometime probably by the mid-1400s, and you get a very different system, and that's when you get the kind of interaction then that the Spaniards observed. Okay, Miles, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you, John. That kind of shows the two different site areas and the different patterns happening on the plains during 1300s and a little bit earlier, and maybe up into around the early 1400s. We'd like to thank all these people, really Butts Leslie, Lee County Society, for the inspired work they did over 50 years ago. Of course, the BLM and Merchant Project team, quite a few people who contributed to this project and all the analyses of material culture and the excavations. And for anyone who's interested, there are reports and volumes available. John's recent book, along with Jamie Clark, available from University of Utah Press, and then 2 volumes on Merchant Site from 2016 and 2020. And these are available from the Carlsbad Field Office or from me if you contact me. And so that is all, and we open to questions or concerns.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Fascinating presentation. I'm so glad that you joined us. We have a lot of questions pouring in, and about 4 minutes. So we are going to send you. Taylor will compile and send the questions to you with whatever contact info we have for the folks who asked, in case they don't get to all of them, which I'm certainly not going to get so get to all of them. I'm gonna pick a few that I think might be able to be lumped together. So give me 1 second here. So I'm gonna ask one and try to, or I'm going to ask a couple together. So there's a lot of interest in kind of the culture area. What does that actually mean? One of our viewers asks, I've heard and read that there is previously interpreted evidence of little or no interaction of what we now refer to as the Pueblo cultures with the indigenous people of the plains. With the evidence that you're presenting, do you think that this significantly changes that narrative? There's similar questions around, is there evidence of mountain communities north of Pueblo influence having similar cooperative relationships with plains bison hunting specialists? And some of our indigenous viewers are interested in the cultural affiliation question, right? Who would you, if you had to, who would you speculate are the descendants of these ancestral communities? So I know that's a lot, but I think they're kind of along the same line. So I'm going to throw that at you and try to kill a few of these birds or bison with one stone, so to speak.
Miles, you want to start, or you want me to start?
I'll let John talk about the history of research into Plains-Pueblo and so forth. As far as ethnic affiliation and indigenous groups, that is one of the more interesting questions, and we really have no information. There were no human remains from Merchant, and that's just wide open. There's a whole series of, as John mentioned, of Spanish accounts of various indigenous groups in that region during Spanish colonial times in the entradas, but trying to pin what this group, where they came from, we do not know, and who they became, at least at Merchant, we really have no idea. And maybe someday with some research, somebody can pinpoint that, but it's a really fascinating question.
Yeah, we do have a lot of human skeletal remains from Henderson, and of course they're under NAGPRA oversight right now, and we have some from Bloom. I didn't really get to talk much about Bloom. The material that was a lot of human remains found by amateurs. The site was, like Merchant, was gutted, but in the 1930s. And they even used a drag line pulled by a pickup truck and just ripped it apart. none of that material survived. Also, some of it was stored in the basement in the Roswell Art Museum, and had a big flood in the 1950s, and none of it was curated properly, and it all got destroyed. So, incidentally, their Bloom Mound did produce 7 copper bells. We, like Miles said, we have no idea about ethnicity. I can say it's unlikely that Henderson was. Years ago, we x-rayed the mandibles from the human remains at Henderson. This was way back in the 80s. And Athabascans have an extra root on one of their teeth. Not every tooth, but it's a high incidence. We found none. So it doesn't suggest they're Athabascans, but that doesn't tell us who they were. And we have no idea. And it's really dangerous to speculate. Because no matter what you say, in a way, it has political implications. And we're very likely going to be wrong if we decide they're probably this group or that group. And we really don't know. In terms of long distance relationships with the Pueblos, I think that was part of the question. Yes, I think, one of the things I've been doing is going through the historical and literature, not only from the Southwest, but elsewhere in North America. And people regularly, commonly traveled up to 100 miles in a single day. There are wonderful stories about kids from Hopi who would go to Winslow, run to Winslow, a drop of about 1,000 feet, just to watch a train come in and then run home again. And I think it's close to 60 miles each way. So the distances that we as Westerners think of as daunting, I don't think we're daunting at all. But it's very hard to get a handle on. The one thing I can say about Roswell, it suggests that these people were all over the place. But that's a pretty vague statement. It's just that the ceramics, we even have a biface. How it got there, I don't know. We have a biface that is from southwestern Wyoming.
Wow.
It's on
Wow.
Tiger Chert. And Bruce Bradley, who knows his lithics, looked at it and said, of course, that's from southwestern Wyoming.
Wow.
They were interacting over a huge area. I have no idea how big.
It's a wonderful takeaway in terms of the way that you said it. The distances that seem daunting to us now were possibly not daunting, or understood different culturally in the past. Really, really fascinating. Do you have so we're 3 minutes over? Would you like to take one more?
Sure. I'm in no hurry to go anywhere, but others might well be.
Well, I'm trying to ask the more the general questions, and we'll send on the specifics to the presenters for those of you in the audience. So I'm sure this is the quintessential question, so I'll put it out there. Do you think that this is Plains hunters adopting Pueblo building techniques, or Pueblo people building further east and learning Plains hunting techniques? Knowing it's more complex than that, but that does seem to pop out.
I can answer it from Roswell. They're bigger than Pueblos physically and smaller than Plains folks physically. They're their own people.
Yeah.
Interesting.
They were neither.
Yeah.
I don't know who they were, but they were their own people.
Wow.
For merchant, the interpretations over the past 60 years have gone both ways. Some people see Southwesterners migrating out and adopting Plains hunting technologies and practices, and then some vice versa. I think there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more generational aspects. You don't just go out on the plains and plop down and start hunting bison. Just like go out and you just don't start sit down and grab some clay and make corrugated ceramics. There are communities of practice and generational transmission of these things. And there's something a lot larger and more subtle that goes into it. So John and I have talked about it several times. There's not really a resolution. And maybe that is the resolution, that it could be half and half are all kinds of different combinations. And we may be asking the wrong questions in terms of identity, because this is a new merged forms of ethnicity and fluid identities and ethnicities forming out there.
Really.
One can raise an interesting issue about this. Do the ceramics, we focus on ceramics a lot. Are the ceramics telling us about the interaction of the communities or about the interactions of women?
Yeah.
So in other words, we may be seeing only part of the political system, the social and political system, and we need something that measures the interactions of men as well.
Wow. Spectacular presentation. You will see that there's lots of compliments in the chat and in the questions that we'll send along. And you have put all of our interest here at Crow Canyon on fire to maybe chat with some of our partners in the Eastern Pueblos and see what they think about who these particular ancestors were. So thank you for your excellent research, and thank you for sharing it with us. We will no doubt be pestering you again in the future.
Okay.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you
My
both
pleasure.
so much. Enjoy the rest of your vacation, Dr. Speth.
Shall do. Bye-bye.
Okay.